So yeah, I'm an anthropologist doing ethnography in central northeastern central Madagascar among this people called the Sihanaka. And today I'm reaching into like history, which is a bit difficult, of course, for an anthropologist, but I'm trying. So what I will talk about today is this problem that takes its point of departure in an argument that Gwen Campbell made a couple of years ago, where he challenged conventional scholarship that says that a lot of slaves were exported from Madagascar, originating in the Mirna Highlands, which he also talked about earlier today. But that couldn't really take place, he argued, because of some environmental restraints, which I will come back to. But what I want to suggest here is that the Sihanaka were, because of the opposite of environmental restraints, they were able to export slaves, and we have sources about slave trade from the Sihanaka. So I will talk a bit about this very fertile Sihanaka environment, and then about slaves among the Sihanaka, and finally I will come to my conclusion. Okay, so a bit about the background to begin with. So as many, I guess most of you know, there was this huge trading network in the Indian Ocean. We have these maps from the recent books by Philippe Bouchard, which show first the oceanic trade to and from Madagascar, and then next to it the inner trade routes in Madagascar. The important places here for my presentation are, if you look at the map to the right of Madagascar, in the north of the country, in the northwest, we have, I guess you can see my cursor. Oh no, I can't even see it myself. But anyway, there's a trading port called Langani, which was the biggest trading port to begin with, and then later on that position was taken over by other trading ports a bit further to the west. And you can see there's this line running down to Lagalot. On my screen it's sort of hidden behind our portraits, but anyway, just behind it we have the lake Alauta, which is the heart of the Sihanaka country. So my presentation begins sort of with the quote from R.J. Berensey, who in his book pointed out that what is sometimes called the maritime history of the Indian Ocean, a tale of ports, merchants, mariners, and companies, cannot be written without constant reference to the camels, porters, and caravans of the hinterland. So this is sort of a look into the hinterlands of Madagascar. Okay, so the research problem here is what I mentioned before. Campbell recently, a couple of years ago, I think it was in that 2018 book that Philip you mentioned in the beginning, he challenged these very high estimations of slaves exported from Madagascar, especially that they could have come from the central region of Imirna. And he sort of goes through three primary reasons for this. First and foremost, Imirna was relatively infertile and needed a lot of labor, so they could not spare to sell off their slaves. They would need them locally. Secondly, the climate is quite different on the Central Highlands and on the coast. So if many of the slaves had come from the highlands, they would have died from tropical diseases like malaria. Thirdly, the sources that we have mention very clearly that these slave caravans coming from the interior of Madagascar not only consisted of slaves but also thousands of cattle. But the thing is that the Mirna don't have that many cattle. It's not a very suitable place to have cattle. So Campbell ends his chapter with saying that the evidence indicates that most slave exports from northwest Madagascar were from the hinterland, were were from the hinterland rather than the highland interior. So that hinterland, well, it could be the area just adjacent to these trading ports, but I would also argue that it makes very much sense to look a bit further inland, to the neighboring region of Imirna, namely the Sihanaka region. So who are the Sihanaka then? They are this ethnic group in the northeast of Madagascar, living in this very fertile area around the Great Lake Alauja. This area is called the rice granary of Madagascar because of its very big agricultural production. So they have a lot of risciculture, fishing, cattle farming, and they have had that for centuries. We have the early sources speak about that. And the Sihanaka are my ethnographic field. That's where I go pretty much every year, unless there is a COVID pandemic which closes down everything, to do ethnographic field work. And I'm working on cosmology, spirits, rituals, etc., and also very much with oral history, like working together with the elders. And I have done some archival research as well, a bit at SOAS, and then compared what I found in the field and with what I found in the archives, so to speak. So this is my attempt to map out chronologically the history of the Sihanaka. There's a lot of information here, but what I want to direct your attention to is the first of these 5 different periods, which I have given different colors. The one I'm trying to say something about is the first one, the early period, the green line, where the Sihanaka were independent, because later on they were dominated, occupied, colonized by the Sakalava and the Mirna, who Campbell also talked about a couple of hours ago, and then the French, and then Madagascar became an independent country. But if we go back to this early period, we will see that this is also the period where the northwest coast of Madagascar had these trading ports where established not by Malagasy people, but by these Arab Swahili traders. First there was the big one, Langani, and after it fell into decline, there were other ones that took over that role. As you can see, if we move our gaze down to the sources, there are not that many sources to be found from the early period. So we have to work with what we have and triangulate that with oral history, as well as this panel is titled, the environment as method, as some sort of source. Yes, so what can we piece together about these early Sihanaka? They were not a unified kingdom like the Mirna or the Sakalava. They were organized in these chiefdoms ruled by so-called panasar, these spiritual leaders. I have an illustration of one of them here. And even though there was no central authority like over all the Sihanaka, they stood together in situations of external enemies invading Sihanaka. They had, at least from the 17th century, we know that they had advanced irrigation, they had plenty of cattle, they had muskets, they were rich in precious metal jewelry. And what they did was that they launched raids against their neighbors, especially on the east coast of Madagascar, and some of these slaves were taken back to Sihanaka, but some were also sold off to the northwest coast. This was not very unusual in Madagascar, in pre-colonial Madagascar. These raids and counter raids and so on were quite common. And the Sihanaka actually accumulated that many slaves in some periods that they had these large-scale slave rebellions. So next to the Panasat here, I have a map. This is from the early colonial period, so this is not from that time, but I think it gives a good impression of the environment there, where you can see the big lake, the biggest in Madagascar, in the center. Then the marshes next to it, plains, and then these rolling hills, perfect for cattle. So this is an ideal environment for riziculture, fishing, cattle farming. All right, so Sihanaka is not only me who calls it a land of plenty, it's something that pretty much every visitor to that region since the 17th century has noted that, whoa, this is so rich in resources. And the French colonists, they had really dreams about exploiting this. It only happened to some degree, but anyway, if we compare the Sihanaka landscape to the Mirna landscape, there are definitely some differences. Before that, I would actually like to go back to, if you remember, in Campbell's presentation, he showed us this picture of like rice field in Balinese style, and these places are certainly also found in Imirna, but that's a quite not recent development, but it happened mostly from the end of the 18th century onwards, as Campbell also points out himself. Before that, I think it mostly looked like the picture I have here, where you could have some irrigation, some agriculture and like the bottom of these valleys, but it required a lot of labor. The land was not easy to work with. And if you look on the other picture, Sihanaka is very flat. It's these wetlands, so it's easy to cultivate, and it's very fertile soil, etc. So I think yeah, definitely some environmental differences there. And if we go back then a couple of hundred years to the period I'm trying to say something about, this is also where we have, and again I'm building on Campbell, what he wrote about the effects of the Little Ice Age on Madagascar. Because in the northern half of the country, where Sihanaka sits, they had increased rainfall, agricultural production, and population growth in this period. And I think it's also notable that it's in this period of Malagasy history that we have the great kingdoms of the north, the Buina, the Atankaran, the Bitsimsarak, and also like the golden age of these Sihanaka chiefdoms. So there's like an abundance of food sources here among the Sihanaka. Not only do they and did they have rice farming as their main food source, but they could also, especially in times of war, sort of go back to like a marsh diet, so to speak, of fish, lots of waterfowl, different plants that you can eat in the marshes. And this is something we know that happened also during the colonial wars against the French, that they would retreat into the swamps and they could sustain themselves there and then go back after the war, sometimes after several years, and cultivate their rice fields again. So that gave a certain resilience in this climate of more or less constant raiding and counter raiding. So I think it's fair to say that life was relatively easy among the Sihanaka, and this area has also been like a sanctuary for migration from elsewhere in Madagascar because, well, it is easier to live here. So it makes sense that the Sihanaka were able to sell off some of their slaves because their agriculture was not as labor intensive as among the Mirna. So moving on to the slaves, there's a lot to say about slavery in Madagascar, but I think the most necessary things to say is that there's been slaves in Madagascar since the beginning of the first Malagasy were people from what is now Indonesia who crossed the Indian Ocean to Madagascar, and they brought with them this Austronesian heritage of society that's divided into 2 or 3 layers. So among the Mirna, we have 3 layers: nobles, commoners, slaves, and among the Sihanaka, we have free people and Devu, the slaves. What the slaves did was farming, herding, domestic work, transportation, things like that. And what Andevo slave means in different parts of Madagascar, that varies quite a bit, but among the Sihanaka, it mostly meant people who were enslaved during raids, and then their descendants. We don't know exactly how many slaves there were among the Sihanaka, but this Malagasy historian, McGill, writes something about it, and he refers to this French census that's the green box that I've put here in the corner. The French counted how many slaves there were in different Sihanaka towns and villages just a year after they colonized the country, and as you can see, it ranges, well, quite a lot, but on average something like almost 50%, and some slave owners had up to 200 slaves. So export of slaves in Madagascar started quite early on in Malagasy history to Arab Swahili ships from around more or less 900 onwards, and then later the Europeans entered the picture, and the international slave trade really like took off to big proportions around the end of the 18th century, and slavery continued until it was abolished when the French colonized the country, but it in many ways it sort of continued as what we call post-slavery, the fact that in many ways the descendants of slaves live lives not very different from those of their ancestors, which is quite sad to see. Yes. So on to the main sources we have about early Sihanaka history. The most important source, the only one from a person who has been to early Sihanaka, is one by this French trader, François Martin. Something is happening here. Yes, and then we have oral history written down by various authors. Yes, the last of which is myself, and then we have this thesis about pre-colonial Sihanaka society. So the most important source is from François Martin, who led this punitive expedition to Sihanaka in the 17th century. And he gives us this detailed account of the land, the people, the relations, etc. The slaving zones of the Sihanaka were people on the east coast, people who are now called the Bitsimsaraka, and also they raided the Mirna people, the Sakalava who dominated the Sihanaka were also sometimes enslaved by counter raids, and perhaps also between Sihanaka groups. So slaves were brought to Sihanaka in such large numbers that many of them escaped and made rebellions. Rasafin Belu points out that slave rebellions were quite unusual in Madagascar, but among the Sihanaka it was quite common actually. And sometimes they needed to call the help of others to quell these rebellions. And there were so many slaves who escaped from the Sihanaka that they crystallized into their own ethnic group, the Maufutsi, to the northwest. Okay. So something I have noticed during my work with the Sihanaka are these numerous signs of old connections between the Sihanaka and the northwest coast, which connections that follow the rivers. This map is not the best to show that because only the biggest rivers are there. But there are like several oral history examples of battles and other events going on along these rivers, and also the Sakalava, who later occupied the northwest coast, they left like a strong imprint on the Sihanaka in terms of culture and linguistic spirit possession and rituals, and some of the chiefs were also from Sakalava. And in the sources from various centuries, we can see that the Sihanaka travel these routes to the northwest coast. For example, this is a picture from a Swedish anthropologist who visited the northwest coast, where he met Sihanaka traders in the beginning of the 20th century. And also, when we look at where the Sihanaka migrated during the late colonial age, it was also northwestwards, towards like along these old connections. So, reaching the conclusion, I think the Sihanaka role in the slave trade has been overlooked. One of the only people who opens up the window a bit is the historian Raymond Kent, who wrote that it's almost certain that the first uva, that's an old word for Mirna, sold into slavery in 1614, as reported by Father Mariano, reached the entrepot through the Sihanaka intermediaries. So back to Campbell's argument, I think that unlike the Mirna, the Sihanaka could have been able to provide many of these slaves to the northwest coast, because to begin with, the first point is that they had this fertile environment, so they could do without many of the slaves which they took during their raids. And secondly, this is a semi-tropical region, and many of the slaves would have been taken from the east coast, which is also tropical, so they would not have died, contrary to the Mirna, who would have died. I mean, also when Mirna went to the Sihanaka region back then, they also died from tropical diseases. And thirdly, the Sihanaka country is quite perfect for cattle herding. They had loads of cattle. So it would make sense if these, at least some of these caravans of slaves and cattle originated in Sihanaka. So that's it.